"I beg your pardon," murmured the visitor in his thin little voice, "but what did you say that feller's name was?"
"Patches. Honorable Patches," answered Phil.
"How strange. Extraordinarily strange. I should be very interested to know something of his ancestry, and, if possible, to trace the origin of such a particular name."
Phil replied with exaggerated concern. "Oh, for heaven's sake, sir, don't say anything about the man's name in his hearing."
He's dangerous, you mean?"
"Oh, he is. If he thinks anyone's making light of his name, you should ask some of the boys who've tried it."
But I assure you, Mr. Acton, I had no thought of ridicule. Far from it. Oh, very, very far."
Kitty was obliged to turn away, as she arrived at the corral in time to meet Patches, who was returning.
"You ought to be ashamed,"
she scolded, but in spite of herself her eyes were laughing. "Yes, ma'am," said Patches meekly, hat in hand.
"How could you do such a thing?" she demanded.
"How could I help but to do it?"
"How could you help it?"
"Yeah, you saw how he looked at me. Really, Miss Reed, I couldn't bear to disappoint him. Such cruelty. Honestly now, wasn't I exactly what he was expecting me to be? I think you should give me a compliment. I thought I did it quite well."
"But he'll think you're nothing but a cowboy," she protested.
"Fine," retorted Patches quickly. "I thank you, Miss Reed. That is most certainly the best compliment I have yet to receive."
"You're mocking me now," said Kitty, puzzled by his manner.
"No, I am not. I'm quite serious," he returned, "but here he comes again. With your gracious permission, I'll make my exit, and please don't explain to the professor, or it would humiliate me, and think how it would shock and disappoint him." Lifting his saddle from the ground and starting towards the shed, he said in a louder tone,
"Sure, I won't forget, Miss Kitty, and you can tell your pa that there bald-faced steer of his, which gived us the slip last rodeo time, is over in our big pasture. I sure seen him over there today." During the days immediately following their first meeting, Kitty passed many hours with Professor Parkhill. Phil and his cowboys were busy preparing for the spring rodeo. Miss Baldwin was wholly occupied with ministering to the animal comforts of her earthly household, and the dean, most courteously and kind to his guest, managed, nevertheless, to think of some pressing business that demanded his immediate and personal attention whenever the visitor sought to engage him with conversation. The professor, quite naturally, holding the cattleman to but a rude and illiterate, wholly manneristic creature, but little superior in his intellectual and spiritual powers to his own beasts, sought merely to investigate the dean's mental works with so little regard for the dean's feeling as a biologist would feel towards a bug. The dean confided to Phil and Patches one day when he was escaping to the blacksmith shop, where the men were shoeing their horses, that the professor was harmlessly insane. "Just think," he exploded, "of the poor little fellow living in Chicago for 3 years and never once going out to the stockyards even." It remained, though, for Kitty, the only worshipper of the professor's gods in Williamson Valley, to supply that companionship which seemed so necessary to even those whose souls were so far removed from material wants. In short, as little Billy put it, with a boy's irreverence, Kitty rode herd on that professor, and strangely enough to them all, Kitty seemed to like the job. Either because of her friendship with Patches, which had come to mean a great deal to Kitty, outweighed her respect and admiration for the distinguished object of his fun, or because she waited for some opportunity to make the revelation a punishment to the offender, the young woman did not betray the real character of the cowboy to the stranger. And the professor, thanks to Phil's warning, not only refrained from investigating the name of Patches, but carefully avoided Patches himself. In the meantime, the typical specimen was forced to take a small part in the table talk lest he betray himself. So marked was this that Miss Baldwin one day, not understanding, openly chided him for being so glum. Whereon the dean, to whom Phil had thoughtfully explained, teased the deceiver unmercifully with many laughing alleged reasons for his grouch, while Curly and Bob attributed their comrade's manner to the embarrassing presence of the stranger, grinned sympathetically, and the professor himself unconsciously agreed with the cowboys, with kindly condescension tried to make the victim of his august superiority as much at ease as possible, which naturally, for the dean and Phil, added not a little to the situation. Then the spring rodeo took the men far from home ranch, and for several weeks the distinguished guest of the Cross Triangle was left almost wholly to the guardianship of the young woman who lived on the other side of the big meadow. It was the last day of the rodeo when Phil rode to the home ranch late in the afternoon to consult with the dean about the shipping. Patches and the cowboys who were to help in the long drive to the railroad were at Toley with the cattle. While the cowboys were finishing their early breakfast the next morning, the foreman returned, and Patches knew, almost before Phil spoke, that something had happened. They shouted their greetings as he approached, but he had no smile for their cheery reception, nor did he answer, until he had ridden close to the group about the campfire. And then, with a short "Mornin', boys," he dismounted and stood with the bridle reins in his hands. At his manner, a hush fell over the little company, and they watched him curiously. "No breakfast, Sam," he said shortly to the Chinaman. "Just a cup of coffee." Then to the cowboys. "You fellows saddle up and get that bunch of cattle to moving. We'll load at Skull Valley." Sam brought his coffee, and he drank it as he stood, while the men hurriedly departed for their horses. Patches was the last to go, paused a moment as though to speak, but Phil prevented him with a gruff order. "Get a move on, Patches. Those cars will be there long before we are." And Patches, seeing the man's face dark and drawn with pain, moved away without a word. "Great snakes," softly ejected Curly a few moments later, as Patches stooped to take his saddle from where it lay on the ground beside Curly's. "What you reckon's eating the boss? Him and the dean couldn't have mixed it up last night, could they? Do you reckon the dean crawled on 'em for something?" Patches shook his head with a "search me, partner," as he turns to his horse. "Something's happened for sure," muttered the other, busy with his saddle blanket. "Suffering cats! But I felt like he was pouring a bucket of ice water down my back." He drew the clinch tight with a vigorous jerk that brought a grunt of protest from his mount. "That's right," he continued, addressing the horse. "You hump yourself and swell up and grunt, damn you. You ought to be thankful that you ain't nothing but a horse nohow. Ain't no feeling except what's in your belly." He dropped the heavy stirrup with a vicious slap and swung to his saddle. "If Phil's a-going to keep up that way he's starting, we'll sure have a pleasant little old ride to Skull Valley. But I wish I was a professor of them there aesthetics, or something nice and gentle like, just for today anyhow." Patches laughed. "Think you'd qualify, Curly?" The cowboy grinned as they rode together. "So far as I've noticed, the main part of the work I could. The shade of them walnut trees at the home ranch, or that pothook-ass front porch, and a nice easy rocking chair with fat cushions, and maybe the buckboard once in a while with Kitty to do the driving. Say, this has been some little rodeo, ain't it? I ain't got a hoss in my string that can more'n stand up, and honest to God, Patches, I'm just corns all over. How's your saddle feeling this morning?" "Oh, it's got corns too," admitted Patches, "but there's Phil. We better get doing some riding."
All that day Phil kept to himself, speaking to his companions only when speech could not be avoided, and then with the fewest possible words. That night he left the company as soon as he had finished his supper, and went off somewhere alone, and Patches heard him finding his bed long after the other members of the outfit were sound asleep. The following morning, through the trying work of loading the cattle, the young foreman was so little like himself that, had it not been that his men were nearly all old-timers and boyhood friends who had known him all his life, there surely would have been a mutiny. It was late in the afternoon when the last reluctant steer was prodded and pushed up the timbered runway from the pens and crowded into the car. Curly and Bob were going with the cattle train. The others would remain at Skull Valley until morning, when they would start for their widely separated homes. Phil announced that he was going to the home ranch that night. "You can make it home sometime tomorrow, Patches," he finished, when he had said his goodbye to the little group of men with whom he had lived and worked in close intimacy over the long weeks of the rodeo. He reined his horse about even as he spoke and set out on his long ride. The Cross Triangle foreman was beyond hearing of the cowboys when Patches overtook him. "Do you mind if I go back to the Cross Triangle with you tonight, Phil?" the cowboy asked quietly. Phil checked his horse and looked at his friend a moment without answering. Then, in a kindlier tone that he had used in the past 2 days, he said, "You better stay here with the boys and get your night's rest, Patches. You've had a hard spell of it this rodeo, and yesterday and today haven't been exactly easy. Shipping is always hell, even when everybody is in good humor." He smiled grimly. "Well, if you don't object, I'd really like to go," said Patches simply. "But your horse is as tired as you ought to be," protested Phil. "I'm riding stranger, you know," the other answered, to which Phil replied tensely, "Well, let's be riding then." The cowboys who had been watching the two men looked at each other in amazement as Phil and Patches rode away together.
"Well, what do you make of that?" "It looks like Honorable Patches was next," commented another. "Us old-timers ain't in it when it comes to associating with the boss," offered a third. "You shut up on that line," came sharply from Curly. "Phil ain't turning us down for nobody. I reckon if Patches is fool enough to want to ride to the Cross Triangle tonight with Phil, he ain't got no reason for stopping him. If any of you punchers want to make the ride, the way's open, ain't it?" "Well, now don't you go on the prod too," soothed the other. "We wasn't meaning nothing agin Phil." "Well, what's the matter with Patches?" demanded the Cross Triangle man, whose heart was solely troubled by the mystery of his foreman's mood. "Ain't nobody said that there's anything against the matter. Fact is, don't nobody know that there is anything."
And, for some reason, Curly had no answer.
"Don't it just naturally beat thunder the way he's been cotton up to that yeller dog of Yawkby Joe?" mused the other, encouraged by Curly's silence. "3 or 4 of the boys told how they'd been seeing them off together off and on, but I didn't think nothing of it until I seen 'em myself when I was working over at Tally Holt. It was one evening after supper. I went down to the corral to fix up that Pedro's horse's back, when I heard horses kind of low like. I stopped a minute and then sort of eased along in the dark and run right into 'em where they were setting in the door of the saddle room, cozy as you please. Yawkby sneaked away while I was getting the lantern and lighting it, but Patches he just stayed and held the light for me while I was fixing old Pedro, just as if nothing had happened." "Well," said Curly sarcastically, "what had happened?" "I don't know, nothing, maybe." "If Patches was that what some of you boys seem to be thinking, do you reckon he'd be a-riding for the Cross Triangle?" demanded Curly. "Well, he might and he might not," retorted 2 or 3 at once. Nobody can't say nothing in case like that until there's a showdown," added one. "I don't reckon the Dean knows any more than the rest of us." "Unless Patches is what some of the other boys are guessing," said another. "Which means," finished Curly in a tone of disgust, "that we've got to mill around the same old ring again. Come on, Bob, let's go see what they got for supper. That Injun will happen along directly, or we'll be starting out hungry."
Phil Acton was not ignorant of the different opinions that were held by the cattlemen regarding Honorable Patches, nor, as the honorable foreman of the Cross Triangle could be, he remained indifferent to them. During those first months of Patches' life on the ranch, when the cowboy's heart had so often been moved to pity for the stranger who had come to them apparently from some pained crisis in his life, he had laughed at the suspicions of his old friends and associates. But as the months passed, and Patches had so rapidly developed into a strong, self-reliant man, with a spirit of bold recklessness that had marked even among those hardy riders of the ranges, Phil forgot, in a measure, those characteristics that the strangers had shown at the beginning of their acquaintance. At the same time, the persistent suspicions of the cattlemen, together with Patch's curious and in a way secret interest in Joe, could not but have a deciding influence upon the young man who was responsible for the Dean's property. It was inevitable, under the circumstances, that Phil's attitude towards Patches should change, even as the character of Patches himself had changed. While the foreman's manner of friendship and kindly regard remained so far unaltered, and while Phil still in his heart believed in his friend, and, as he would have said, would continue to back his judgment until the showdown, nevertheless that spirit of intimacy which had been marked those first days of their work together had gradually been lost to them. The cowboy no longer talked to his companion as he had talked that day when they lay in the shade of the walnut tree of the tally-ho, and during the following days of their riding range. He no longer admitted his friend into his inner life, as he had done that day when he told Patches the story of the wild stallion. And Patches, feeling the change, and unable to understand the reason for it, waited patiently for the time when the cloud that had fallen between them should lift. So they rode together that night, homeward bound at the end of a long, hard weeks of the radio, in the deepening gloom of the day's passing, in the hushed stillness of the wild land, under the wild sky where the starry sentinels' hosts were gathering for their ever-faithful watch. And, as they rode, their stirrups almost touching, each was alone in his own thoughts. Phil, still in the depths of his somber mood, brooded over his bitter trouble. Patches sympathetically wondered, silently questioning, wished he could help. There are times when a man's very soul forces him to seek companionship. Alone in the night with this man of whom, even at the first moment of their meeting of the divide, he had felt a strange sort of kinship, Phil found himself drifting far from the questions that had risen to mar the closeness of their intimacy. The work of the rodeo was over. His cowboy associates, with their suggestive talk, were far away. Under the influence of long, dark miles of that night, and the silent presence of his companion, the young man, for the time being, was no longer the responsible foreman of the Cross Triangle Ranch. In all that vast and silent world there was, for Phil Acton, only himself, his trouble, and his friend.